limiting how much my son's girlfriend can spend. The grocery bill that exposed a financial power struggle. I never thought a simple grocery run would turn into a financial standoff that exposed entitlement, boundaries, and money expectations inside my own home. But that's exactly what happened the moment my son told me to just give her the card. I'm a 52-year-old mother, financially stable, careful with budgeting, and very intentional about how money is spent in my household. My son, 23, graduated from university in June and moved back home while he started his career. I didn't charge him rent. I never have. I believe that if parents can help their kids get on their feet, they should. A few months later, his long-distance girlfriend, Carmela, 21, fell into a tough spot. She took time off college, lived with her mom, and then her mom told her she couldn't stay anymore. My son was already planning to move out in January and had invited her to live with him then, but she needed somewhere to stay sooner. They asked if she could stay with us temporarily. I agreed. No rent, no utilities, no pressure. Just be respectful and help keep the house clean. Financially, I could afford it, but that doesn't mean unlimited spending was part of the deal. Carmela was polite, friendly, and eager to contribute. She insisted on cooking dinner as a way to say thank you. I appreciated the gesture and told her it wasn't necessary, but she truly enjoyed cooking. At first, it felt like a win-win. Then came the groceries. One evening, she said she needed ingredients we didn't have. I handed her my card and told her to grab what she needed and some things we could all use. She did, and dinner was great. A few days later, she asked again, then again. Soon, grocery trips became frequent and the receipts grew longer. I started noticing premium items, steak, seafood, specialty cheeses, brand-name snacks, things I normally budget for carefully or reserve for special occasions. To be clear, this wasn't malicious. Carmela wasn't stealing. She simply wasn't budgeting. And that's where the financial disconnect began. On Sunday, I gently asked her to get everything she'd need for the week in one trip, and she agreed. I thought the issue was solved. Then on Monday night, after dinner, she mentioned wanting to make steak on Thursday. My son immediately lit up. "That sounds amazing," he said. Then he turned to me and said casually and confidently, "Mom, give her the card." That sentence hit me harder than any receipt ever could, because it wasn't about steak. It was about entitlement. It was about financial assumptions. It was about my money being treated like a shared resource without conversation. I said no, calmly, firmly. I explained that I had already funded grocery shopping for the week and that steak for 6 people wasn't in the budget. I added that I appreciated Carmela cooking, but going forward, there needed to be a budget. The room went quiet. Carmela looked embarrassed. My son looked offended. Later that night, my son confronted me privately. He said I had embarrassed his girlfriend, that she was just trying to be nice, that they were only here a few weeks, that I could afford it. That's when I realized something critical. My son didn't see my money as my money. He saw it as an extension of his comfort. From a financial perspective, this was a boundary problem, not a generosity problem. I was already subsidizing housing, utilities, food, and living expenses. Adding unlimited grocery spending wasn't kindness. It was creating entitlement without accountability. What bothered me most wasn't Carmela. She's young, she's unemployed. She likely assumed this was okay because no limits were ever discussed. That part was on me. The real issue was my adult son, employed, rent-free, and comfortable directing how my money should be spent. That night, I reviewed my household finances. Rising food costs, inflation, discretionary spending, it all adds up quickly. Generosity without structure becomes resentment, and resentment poisons families. I decided something had to change. But before making any final decisions, I needed to understand whether this was a one-time misunderstanding or the start of a deeper financial power struggle inside my own home. And that realization set the stage for what came next. Dinner on my dime. By the second week of Carmela living in our home, the financial patterns had become impossible to ignore. At first, I brushed it off as generosity mixed with youth. She was trying to prove herself, trying to show gratitude by cooking dinner almost every night, and I appreciated it, truly. But appreciation doesn't magically pay grocery bills, and the numbers were starting to speak louder than my politeness. I've always been careful with money, not cheap. Careful. There's a difference. I raised my son with that principle. Spend intentionally, save consistently, and don't confuse generosity with entitlement. So when Carmela started using my card multiple times a week, I initially assumed she simply didn't understand how household budgeting works when you're feeding 6 people instead of 1 or 2. The receipts told a different story. Steaks, fresh seafood, specialty cheeses, imported sauces. Nothing outrageous on its own, but together they added up fast. My weekly grocery budget had quietly ballooned by nearly 40%. I found myself mentally adjusting other expenses just to compensate. Fewer extras, postponed purchases, all to support meals I hadn't asked for. What bothered me most wasn't the money itself, it was the lack of conversation. Carmela never once asked, "Is this okay?" My son never once said, "Mom, let me chip in." Instead, it slowly became assumed. That assumption hit me square in the chest on Sunday afternoon when Carmela asked for my card again. I hesitated, then handed it over with one request. "Please get everything you'll need for the week in one trip." She smiled. "Of course." I believed her. Monday night shattered that illusion. As we cleared the dishes, Carmela casually mentioned wanting to make steak on Thursday. My son immediately lit up like this was already decided. Then came the sentence that changed everything. "Mom, give her the card." Not ask, not suggest, demand. Something in me snapped, not emotionally, but financially. I realized in that moment that this wasn't about dinner anymore. It was about boundaries, about respect, about how quickly gratitude can slide into entitlement when no one speaks up. I said no. The room went silent. I explained calmly that I had already funded groceries for the week and that steak for 6 people wasn't in the budget. I even offered a compromise, maybe Christmas dinner instead. But when I said I'd need to put a budget in place if Carmela wanted to continue cooking, I saw the shift immediately. Carmela looked embarrassed, my son looked offended, and suddenly I was the villain. Later that night, my son confronted me privately. He said I had embarrassed Carmela, that she was just trying to be nice, that they were only staying a few more weeks, that I should just let it go. But here's the truth he didn't want to hear. Being a guest does not mean unlimited access to someone else's wallet. I reminded him that neither of them was paying rent, that utilities, groceries, and household expenses had quietly increased since Carmela moved in, that if he wanted steak dinners, he was welcome to pay for them himself. That conversation wasn't comfortable, but it was necessary. From a financial perspective, this situation was a perfect example of silent budget erosion, small, repeated expenses justified by emotion rather than agreement. No malicious intent, just unchecked spending combined with blurred roles. That's how resentment grows. I went back to my spreadsheet that night and updated it honestly. Household costs, increased grocery spending, projected expenses through January. The data confirmed what my instincts already knew. Without intervention, this would become a recurring issue, not just now, but in how my son approaches money in his own household someday. So I decided to teach, not punish. The next morning, I sat them both down. I thanked Carmela genuinely for cooking. Then I laid out the numbers, calmly. No accusations, just math. I explained budgets, fixed expenses, variable costs, why steak isn't a casual purchase for large households. I told them that generosity must align with capacity or it becomes a burden disguised as kindness. They listened. Really listened, and for the first time I saw understanding replace defensiveness. This wasn't about control, it was about sustainability, and sometimes the most loving thing you can do for your child and their partner is to say no before yes becomes expectation. The dinner budget that broke the family illusion. By the third week after the budget conversation, the tension in the house had become impossible to ignore. Nothing explosive was happening on the surface, but everything felt tight, like a room where everyone was holding their breath. Carmela was still polite, still helpful, but no longer enthusiastic. My son was distant, and I, for the first time, felt like the villain in my own home simply for protecting my finances. That night, I sat at the kitchen table alone, reviewing my monthly expenses. 6 adults in one house was no small financial strain. Utilities, groceries, water, electricity, gas. Even without charging rent, my household costs had risen nearly 40% since Carmela moved in. That might not sound dramatic to some people, but I live on a fixed budget. Every extra dollar out is a dollar that doesn't go toward retirement, emergencies, or future health care. What bothered me most wasn't the money. It was the entitlement creeping into the situation. The next evening, my son finally confronted me. He accused me of being petty, of making money a problem when it didn't have to be. He said Carmela felt embarrassed, that budgeting her grocery spending made her feel like a burden. I listened quietly, then asked him one simple question. "Are you paying for the groceries she's using?" He said no. "Are you paying rent?" No. Utilities? No again. That's when I realized the real issue wasn't the budget, it was financial blindness. My son had graduated college, had a full-time job, and yet still thought resources were infinite because he'd never been required to manage them. Carmela, bless her heart, came from a home where money was unstable, so generosity was her survival mechanism. She showed love through cooking expensive meals, through excess, because scarcity scared her. But good intentions don't pay bills. That weekend, I sat both of them down, not to argue, but to educate. I pulled out actual numbers, monthly grocery averages, utility increases, the difference between discretionary spending and necessities. I explained retirement planning, emergency funds, and why just a few steaks wasn't actually a small expense when multiplied across a household and over time. Their expressions changed. For the first time, my son looked uncomfortable, not defensive, but aware. Carmela finally spoke and admitted she hadn't realized how much things cost. She said cooking was helping because that's what she'd always been told. I told her something important. Helping doesn't mean overspending someone else's money. Helping means respecting boundaries. That conversation changed the dynamic completely. My son offered to start contributing to groceries immediately. Carmela asked for a weekly budget, voluntarily this time. And suddenly, the resentment evaporated. Once finances were transparent, emotions settled. Money hadn't been the villain, miscommunication was. Over the next few weeks, something surprising happened. My son began learning real financial responsibility. He asked questions about budgeting, about savings, about how much rent actually costs. Carmela found a part-time job and insisted on buying groceries with her own money for meals she cooked. What had started as a conflict over steak turned into a lesson neither of them had received before. Adulthood costs money, and someone always pays. And this time, it wasn't going to be me alone. The dinner budget line. By the time the tension over groceries settled into an uncomfortable silence, I realized this wasn't about steak or seafood anymore. It was about money boundaries and how easily they blur when family, gratitude, and entitlement mix. I had replayed that dinner conversation in my head a dozen times. The look on Carmela's face wasn't anger, it was embarrassment. And my son's reaction wasn't concern, it was expectation. That realization hit me harder than anything else. The next morning, I sat down with my household budget, something I've maintained religiously for years. 6 adults in one house meant utilities had spiked, groceries were up nearly 40%, and incidental expenses, paper goods, cleaning supplies, gas, were quietly bleeding my account. I could afford it, yes, but affording something doesn't mean it's sustainable or fair. I noticed something else, too. My son had not once offered to contribute. Not rent, not groceries, not gas. He had a job, he was saving for his apartment, and yet he had no hesitation volunteering my debit card for expenses he didn't plan, shop for, or pay. That's when the financial lesson became unavoidable. When you don't charge people, even adult children, anything, you remove their sense of cost entirely. That afternoon, I asked my son to sit down with me. Just us. No raised voices, no accusations. I opened my budgeting spreadsheet and showed him the numbers. Grocery spending, weekly increases, per meal averages. He looked stunned, not defensive, not angry, just genuinely unaware. "This is what it costs," I said calmly. "And when I say no, it's not because I don't appreciate Carmela, it's because I'm the only one funding this." He tried to explain that Carmela was just trying to help and that cooking was her way of contributing since she didn't have a job yet. I acknowledged that immediately because it mattered, but I followed it with the truth. Cooking isn't contributing if someone else pays without limits. That was the moment the conversation shifted. I explained something I learned years ago. Gratitude without boundaries eventually becomes entitlement, not maliciously, slowly, quietly, until someone finally says no, and suddenly they're the villain. I told him that moving forward there would be structure. If Carmela wanted to cook for the house, I'd set a weekly grocery budget, meals would be planned ahead, no midweek extra shopping trips, and if you wanted premium items, steak, seafood, specialty ingredients, he would pay the difference. There was a pause. Then he nodded. Later that evening, Carmela approached me alone. She apologized. Not in an exaggerated way, just sincerely. She said she hadn't realized how expensive things were and assumed I was comfortable because I never said anything before, and that was on me. I told her the truth. I appreciated her effort, her kindness, and her cooking, but I also needed predictability. A household runs on planning, not assumptions. We sat down together and planned the next week's meals with a fixed budget. She lit up when she realized constraints weren't criticism, they were clarity. She even suggested affordable alternatives and batch cooking meals to save money. That told me everything I needed to know about her character. The real discomfort lingered with my son, because what he learned that week wasn't about groceries, it was about adulthood. You don't get to outsource costs to someone else and still make demands. You don't get to make guests happy with money that isn't yours, and you don't get to treat financial boundaries like personal attacks. By the end of the week, he transferred money to my account without being asked. Not a huge amount, but it wasn't the amount that mattered. It was the awareness. Sometimes the most important financial lesson parents teach isn't generosity, it's limits. And in this house, everyone, guest or family, was about to learn that money respect matters just as much as good intentions. The grocery budget war. By the time everything finally came to a head, I realized this was never really about groceries. It was about money, boundaries, and respect, and how quickly all three can disappear when expectations aren't clearly defined. The tension had been building for weeks. Carmela continued cooking dinners, and I continued feeling quietly anxious every time she mentioned another meal plan that involved steak, shrimp, or specialty ingredients. I didn't want to discourage her kindness, but I also couldn't ignore the growing grocery bills. Inflation wasn't hypothetical. It was hitting my bank account every week. Feeding 6 people on one income required discipline, not vibes. After the budget conversation blew up, my son barely spoke to me. Carmela became more distant, polite but reserved. I hated the awkwardness, but I also knew I had done the right thing. Financial clarity often feels cruel to people who benefit from ambiguity. That's when I decided to sit my son down alone. I showed him the numbers, actual numbers, monthly grocery costs, utility bills, property taxes, insurance. I explained how letting expenses slide just a little each week was how people ended up in debt despite having decent incomes. I reminded him that neither he nor Carmela was paying rent, not a dollar. He looked uncomfortable, but finally he listened. I told him something that changed the entire dynamic. When someone else controls the money, they control the rules. If Carmela wanted full freedom to cook elaborate meals, that was fine, but it couldn't be on my debit card. Financial generosity has limits, and ignoring them breeds resentment. I wasn't trying to punish anyone, I was protecting the household. To his credit, something clicked. 2 days later, my son transferred money into my account and apologized for assuming, for demanding, for embarrassing me. He said he hadn't realized how entitled he sounded. He admitted that having no financial responsibilities had dulled his awareness. That moment alone made the entire conflict worth it. Carmela approached me later that evening. She looked nervous but sincere. She apologized for overstepping and admitted she had no real sense of grocery budgeting because she'd never been responsible for it before. We talked, not emotionally, but practically. I explained weekly limits, bulk buying, and planning meals around sales instead of cravings. From then on, everything changed. They started paying for groceries once a week. The meals became simpler but more thoughtful, and the tension gone. More importantly, my son learned a lesson that will save him tens of thousands of dollars over his lifetime. Being an adult means understanding money before it understands you. By the time they moved into their own place, I noticed something unexpected. They were cooking at home, budgeting, tracking expenses, not because they were forced to, but because they finally understood. And I realized something else, too. Setting financial boundaries doesn't make you unkind, it makes you responsible. If anything, this situation reinforced why financial literacy should be taught early, especially to young adults who confuse generosity with obligation. Money doesn't care about intentions, only structure. I didn't lose my son. I didn't hurt Carmela. I taught both of them something invaluable, and that's worth more than steak dinners. Have you ever felt guilty for setting financial boundaries with family or guests? Were you wrong, or were you just being responsible? If this story hit close to home, hit subscribe. We share powerful stories about protecting your money, your peace, and your future. New high-stakes stories every week. Don't miss the next one.